How do you get from escaping a tumultuous home life to performing in the arts, performing in Hollywood, to being of acclaim and respected for the representation that you offer, all while seemingly denigrating other people on some level? And I think the answer is complicated. Is there room for him to advocate for other people while also advocating for himself? I do feel like I covered a lot in the other videos, but there is a central question that I think guides a lot of the rationale behind this James Baldwin biopic. And there are so many things that this is connected to. It's connected to identity, blackness, queerness, the importance of representation, trauma. How do Black people and LGBTQIA people represent, talk about, express our trauma? How does that trauma become fuel for the various things in our lives? How all of this is connected to this myth of Black progress, which I've spoken about in different videos in the past, but I do feel like it's important to have another space to really break this down. And so this video is going to be good for anyone that really wants to break down the different complex angles of how LGBTQIA people deal with their trauma. And this is a complex topics. It's a lot, but I want to start it out by saying the research that I did for this essay, the research that I did for this video, it really made me think about it made me think a lot about the relationship between James Baldwin to Billy Porter to myself, because we're all LGBTQIA Black men, but we've all reacted to our trauma in different ways.
When you were starting out as a writer, you were a Black, impoverished, homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
For those who don't know, there is a forthcoming James Baldwin biopic that is currently in the works. Billy Porter announced this last year in 2023 that he would co-write, co-lead, and be a heavy producer on this film with the Byron Allen Media Group. This biopic has been in the works, and recently there was a Guardian interview where Porter basically said, I don't care about James Baldwin's stances on the Middle East or Muslims or colonization. There are varying degrees of Zionist propaganda, and there's the propaganda that says, oh, literally Palestinians are basically synonymous with Hamas, or Hamas is the reason that these non-combatants are dying. It's not Netanyahu or Israel or their genocidal logic. Another area of Zionism, I don't know much about what's happening, but I'm gonna stand by Israel because otherwise it's anti-Semitic, is a result of propaganda. And I think when you watch that, when you read that Guardian interview, you can detect a lot of that in there, and you look at the ways that Black people have been enfolded into that logic. Check out that video. And I also plan to do a whole video about Black Zionism and the different reasons for it. Billy Porter is an actor who is one of the few represented as himself in this high level of the industry. How many triple or quadruple threats are working in the industry that are openly Black, openly gay, can do the things that Porter does? And so I think if you're gonna like be a fan or an advocate for Porter, there is this side of it all where it's like, why drag him down? Or he worked hard to get where he is. And this isn't to negate the fact that someone can work hard to get where they are, but there is the question of, what do you sacrifice in your own journey to success? And how does that put other people beneath you or allow you to ignore other people's struggles, other people's atrocities, other people's dilemmas? And I think this is going to be a core element of this conversation around Porter, because I do think there is this weird correlation that you can make between Porter and his desire to be represented in a certain way with clarity and authenticity, although a lot of it is muddled in these weird politics of wanting to fit into the Hollywood industry. There's James Baldwin, who was ousted by various aspects of the Black community for being gay, for being queer, and how he had a very complicated relationship with whiteness, and how both of these figures in a lot of ways can or could represent each other, but the pathways that both of them take to their theories of change are very, very different. No Black or LGBTQIA person or group of people are a monolith. And some of the people in that spectrum in the community believe in queer and trans liberation. They believe in gender abolition. They believe in not even wanting LGBTQIA-ness to be legible to the state because that means we're being enfolded. And these are complicated perspectives on a future trajectory that I think we're all still struggling towards, especially when capitalism in many spaces and demographics also equals autonomy, which I think is a vagrant conflation that we need to be against, because to me, capitalism is the reason that we're here. To say that capitalism can save us is like saying that the master's tools can dismantle the master's house. I want to talk about the relevance of queer trauma. Queer trauma can be such a fuel for LGBTQIA or queer people. And queer trauma can come across as the heteronormativity that we've been raised with, the gender politics that has been forced onto us, the double standards around the heterosexual or the straight community versus how LGBTQA people, gay people, queer people are judged, and how all of these things can make us feel displaced in a world that we've been born into. Billy Porter published a memoir in 2021 called Unprotected, and this memoir was really acclaimed. There are numerous good reviews on it online. A lot of the reviews speak about Billy Porter's candor, his vulnerability, his unflinching honesty about the trauma and the obstacles that he went through in the industry. And I think it also makes sense that this book came out in 2021, because I imagine that Billy Porter was probably writing this in 2019, 2020, reacting to the times, reacting to the pandemic, and how in a lot of ways 2020 was a big moment for a lot of different people to have the time to step back and reflect. So it does make sense that he's writing this memoir. There is a New York Times review of Porter's book, and I'll just read a few excerpts from it. Porter grew up in a Pittsburgh Hills district where he attended a homophobic Pentecostal black church that nonetheless stoked him in a devotion to performance. It goes on to say, Porter's talents propelled him to great heights. He made his Broadway debut in Miss Saigon when he was 21 years old, but the actor found that both in church and on stage, he was embraced for what he could do with his voice while simultaneously rejected for who he was about black gay man. And then it goes on to state again, elsewhere, he reflects on his career's highs and lows, like finding himself homeless and bankrupt after early successes, notably as Teen Angel in Greece, left him lost in the wilderness that he memorably dubs his millennial coon show era. I've read probably the first 3 chapters, and I tried to pull from as much as I could. I plan to read more and dig into this more. I spent time reading through different parts of this book yesterday, and I wanted to pull apart some quotes from it and analyze it. So one quote is earlier on in the book, probably around chapter 2 or 3. And this, Billy Porter is in middle school, I believe. And this is a new school in a predominantly black neighborhood. And niggas are messing with him. They're planning to play games. They're trying to mess with Porter. And this is what happens. Wanting to mess with me, Porter says, I told my mom not to pick me up, so I would have to walk past them by myself. This is in reference to the bullies. I summoned all the courage I had and made myself move in their direction, keeping my gaze on the ground as I drew near, and then suddenly, with no warning, the tall boy shoved me hard. I slammed into the ground and tumbled down the hill. I tried to stop myself but couldn't. The world, a blur of grass and sky and dirt, and even with the confusion of my panic and pain, I was aware of the laughter floating down around me. All the other kids, it seemed, were ridiculing me, hooting and hawing and snickering, and bam! The left side of my face banged to the bottom of the steel-spoked fence. After several dazed seconds, I tried to gather myself and rise, but I couldn't. I was stuck in place, impaled like an insect on a pin. And then later on, after this, Billy Porter wakes up in the hospital, basically has to admit to his mother that he is being bullied, and has to go through this process of people in his family saying, turn the other cheek. And this other family member is kind of like, stand up for yourself. And he's really given this Christian ideology of these kids don't know what they mean. And they're like trying to like spread lies on you, XYZ. So when Porter wakes up in the hospital, no one there likes me, Porter says. They call me names. They wanted to beat me up. What's the names they calling you? Wimp, pussy, sissy, Porter says. Mommy looked away for a moment, her lips pursed and her gaze turned inward. I could tell she was trying to find the right words to say, and then suddenly they seemed to come to her, for resolve came into her eyes, and her gaze found mine again. They crucified Jesus, baby. You'll be fine. There was only one place in the world where people looked at me with approval, admiration, and even respect. That blessed place was Friendship Baptist Church Choir. My first solo had happened when I was 5 at the annual Easter Sunday pageant, where I sang His Eyes is on the Sparrow in my clear and open-throated gospel, boy soprano. That day had been a revelation. As I stood in front of that sanctuary and let the song come through me, I had watched a ripple go through the congregation like an electric current. Everything had changed when I sang. Something shifted in the adults around me and changed the very air in the room. The fear and the shame left the grown ups' eyes, and they all praised what they saw. And then Porter goes on to say that in various productions, theater shows that he was in, he faced all sorts of racism, all sorts of microaggressions, having songs not adjusted to his vocal range, not being offered certain parts, being criticized because of the way that he spoke. This memoir is very much a distillation of Porter's trauma. And partway through the book, you can actually read that Porter says, like, it's time for me to let go of my trauma. It's time for me to let go of the past and move forward towards something else. But when we're looking at this question of queer trauma, of resilience, of Black progress, where does all of this actually lead to? And what do we do once we claim that we faced our trauma?
And also positioning the storytelling in a way where we can talk about healing, especially for Black queer men, especially for anybody Black and queer, especially for anybody queer, especially for anybody who feels like they're an outcast, especially for anybody, ... who can read this book and be freed.
Another part of this memoir that I think is really significant and necessary to mention is that Porter speaks about his experience with sexual assault at a young age. What is really intense and interesting and sad when we look at this is that Porter was eventually able to confront his mother about this abuse. Porter eventually left home, went to college, studied in the theater, studied in the arts, and throughout the memoir, he says again and again, the arts saved me. The arts is where I could be seen. The arts is where I felt like I could be respected or my voice mattered. And during his college years, his mother calls home and says, basically, your family member, his family member is sick. Porter says, I don't really want to talk about this person because they're the person that abused me. And when I was reading this account, I was kind of like, oh, this sounds really kind of familiar. And when you watch Pose, when you watch the last season, the Take Me to Church episode, Billy Porter's character, Pray Tell, returns home, confronts his religious trauma, confronts the underlying abuse of his childhood, confronts these disjointed identities and how he needed to make peace with them. So I'm editing right now, and one major thing that I want to mention in this video, as a writer, as a memoirist, I was deeply fascinated by the parts of Billy Porter's book that I read. And granted, I still need to read the whole thing. I've read like the first 5 chapters, but I will say this. In this topic of queer trauma and where it leads us in artistry and expression, I do think the things that people write and the purposes they serve, that meaning is generated both through the act of what you write, it's generated through the act of that art being able to engage with the public, and it's also generated by the artist's actions after that artwork goes into the world. Are you expressing a series of values in your artwork that don't match up with your real life? And what does it mean to be a queer artist, to express queer history, which is complex, which has people that align with capitalism or heteronormativity or internalized homophobia? What can we detect in a work? And what is the point of a radical narrative? What is the point of a queer narrative, of a subversive narrative? Can there be queer narratives that aren't subversive, or are they inherently subversive? Why or why not? This is why the topic of assimilation and capitalism is so important, because I do think there have been periods of time throughout our cultural history where queer narratives were probably considered way more subversive, and now it's kind of like it can be Billy Porter kissing Joe Biden's hand at the White House. And so I'm also just interested in the idea of crafting our own narrative around trauma, and when we're being honest and how we're being honest about what part. Are we actually healed, or is this just marketing? This is why I thought Pose was such an interesting and beautiful, if not perfect, show. There were numerous actors and actresses in the show that were kind of given license to have episodes that could express and help them work through some of the trauma of their background. The character, Electra Evangelista, she had a whole episode exploring her family and the Caribbean trauma and having come out as trans. And like, when you think about Pose as a vehicle for these actors and actresses being able to confront their trauma, it makes it a much more interesting case for queer and LGBTQI representation. And I think this is even more interesting with all of the criticisms of Pose and the production, the criticisms of Ryan Murphy and the call outs against him for pay. The fact that on other sets that Ryan Murphy did, that the actress Angelica Ross stated how transphobic Emma Roberts was. And then when we dig into the Pose element even more, there's the element that Billy Porter was in hot water for basically saying, I have worked so hard to have my career. These other stars on the show, these other like LGBTQI people should just be grateful that there's representation. Like, we just don't know how to be happy for a good thing. How do you get from escaping a tumultuous home life to performing in the arts, performing in Hollywood, to being of acclaim and respected for the representation that you offer, all while seemingly denigrating other people on some level? And I think the answer is complicated. If Porter claims that he is leaving his past and his trauma behind, what else is he leaving behind along with this pain and trauma? Is Porter leaving behind an allegiance to other Black people, other Black LGBTQIA people, other Black folks that are denigrated and disenfranchised, especially in Hollywood and in the entertainment industry, in ways that he might not even understand? Is there room for him to advocate for other people while also advocating for himself? And why does Porter's individual idea of success equal being at the White House during Juneteenth, kissing Joe Biden's hand, aligning with the state of Israel, denigrating those in the Middle East, not being able to speak clearly to the complexities of our Black histories, but being able to speak about how he lost his house and how he wasn't being hired as much and how he didn't make fuck you money? And so once again, I bring this back to my point that I made in my other video. It's important to note what we leave behind when we're processing our trauma. It can be so easy to think that processing our trauma and healing means that the collective struggle is done. And that is not the case, which is why we're going to dig into queer trauma next. Representation is only going to matter more and more, because in this dangerous era of the internet age, of disinformation, of co-optation, identity will only matter more and more, because the further that we're able to mutilate identity, the more we're able to sway away from the truth and turn towards spectacles of violence and storytelling that inoculate us into a false sense of history and also a very reduced idea of what these identities are in the first place. And that's the reason that these bad biopics are on the rise. If identity is a sort of category that the entertainment industry and production companies can tap into in order to target and profit off of a certain kind of demographic, that is one level of co-optation. Inauthentically using people's identities to tell stories that will get that demographic into those seats, buying tickets, and potentially raising millions of dollars is not that far off from the entertainment industry's recent desire to shovel out a shit ton of bad biopics.
Broadway stage clothes. And I know this outfit is supposed to be like she's a strong Black leader, but she looks like she's about to dead-ass challenge Picasso to a paint-off.
And this is kind of the conundrum of the built-in audience and what capitalism assumes. If you have a famed figure like Elvis, who has had a decades-long career, is considered one of the greatest musicians of all time, is going to be considered an intergenerational icon, no matter where you are in terms of like modern human history. It makes sense for a production company to dump a bunch of money into a project to find a lead actor, a A-level actor, or a B-list actor, and put them in that movie, because that built-in fan base is going to be an assumed profit for that project. And this is why biopics can be dangerous, because biopics are they're an opportunity to authentically depict, or at least carefully depict, a certain kind of history. And since biopics are so aligned with identity, since you can't make a Selena biopic without like really delving into Latinx culture and the complexities of Latinx American identity. So when we're looking at biopics and the ways that they're being made and how they are the merging of this sort of co-optation and utilization of identity in the mainstream Hollywood system, along with how biopics become this built-in audience for a certain icon's demographic and their cultural background, we can see why these bad biopics are a decent bet for these production companies. And when I say decent bet, I don't mean like it's a good bet. In a world where identity is further and further being assimilated into the internet, the social age, into disinformation, into hot takes, and where is the nuance? And that's why this question of trauma is also interesting, because if you look at biopics, they're usually subjects that are considered tragic individuals, people that died too soon, people that offered so much but were offered so little back. If we look at the Harvey Milk biopic, which was played by Sean Penn, a white actor, Harvey Milk was an activist who advocated for LGBTQIA rights in San Francisco, who ran for government, who won and was eventually gunned down. Why is it that this biopic is both a commemoration of the spectacle of violence, but also can be considered a historical document? Let's look at Nina Simone's biopic, which was famously criticized for having Zoe Saldana play a lead role, a lighter-skinned person of color playing Nina Simone, who is a dark-skinned Black woman. I even read in researching that they darkened her skin tone. They had to add prosthetics onto her. And eventually, years later, Zoe Saldana apologized. If we look at the Elvis biopic that came out a few years ago, I mentioned this, I walked out of that movie, I fucking hated it. But the Elvis biopic totally ignored all of the mainstream criticism about Elvis literally being coercive towards a minor and then eventually marrying her. But then they could show him going to a Black church and having the Holy Spirit. Why not? In this discussion of bad biopics, I think we have to understand that when capitalists are put at the helm of telling stories about our histories, especially more subversive, radical, or marginalized histories, we have to account for the fact that it's the job of capitalism, of white supremacy, of colonization, of historical erasure to sanitize these histories to make them more palatable for wider audiences. If you're making a Black radical movie about James Baldwin, best believe there are going to be entire audiences of people that are not going to be into that because it's going to be too abrasive to them. If you're making an intense movie about and so there is this contradiction of how do you make a radical narrative about a radical history that is more palatable to a modern audience that isn't privy to the complexities of that history. And they often lead to spectacles of violence without meaningful conversations about why these histories happened, how these histories have led to our present moment, and why those spectacles of violence in the past are deeply and intimately connected to the spectacles of violence that we are seeing today. What does it mean to struggle for representation in a culture and a political world that is financially incentivized to erase us? And how do we oppose this erasure? And I found this article that is out there with the Cato Institute titled "Capitalism, Not Socialism, Led to Gay Rights." Okay, this piece reads, once capitalism created the opportunity for people to autonomously, it unwittingly allowed LGBT people to privilege homosexual desire as a driving force in their lives. Despite his left leanings, D'Amelio saw the world more clearly than Downs does. All the advances in human rights that we've seen in American history, abolitionism, feminism, civil rights, gay rights, stem from our founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The emphasis of the individual mind in the Enlightenment, the individualist nature of market capitalism, and the demand for individual rights that inspired the American Revolution naturally led people to think more carefully about the nature of the individual and gradually to recognize the dignity of individual rights should be extended to all. This doesn't make any fucking sense to me. To say the advances in human rights that we've seen in human history, abolitionism, feminism, civil rights, gay rights, stem from our founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were the literal reason that white people and colonizers justified slavery. They said that my white life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can be at the expense of these indigenous people, at the expense of these Black people. And so to purport that all of these things stem from, like the founding documents. The founding documents were literally made by people that owned slaves. And this queer trauma and how it shoves us towards capitalism can be really important, because I also found a Washington Post piece also mentions it. Billy Porter also mentions this in his book. But essentially, like, if folks have seen my Malcolm X biopic video, James Baldwin tried to write a biopic about Malcolm X after his assassination. There's a very interesting history here. So in that video, I explained that first James Baldwin was supposed to make that movie, hated the process of it, fled it. Then years later, Spike Lee was brought on to make that movie. In Billy Porter's memoir, he mentions auditioning for this film and being called out by Spike Lee specifically. This is page 143 of Unprotected. The not black enough trope was something I was used to hearing in my life. From the moment I started talking, I spoke in a complete and clear sentences, forging the normalization of black slang, or what was commonly called ebonics. You talk like a white boy, kids will bully. Damn, come to think of it, I even got that shit from adults. When I was just starting out in New York, film director Spike Lee made a point to call me out at an audition for his seminal masterwork, Malcolm X. Why are you talking like that? He irritably snarked at me with disdain. Talk like what? I clapped back before I could even think about my tone. You talk like a white boy, Lee said back. And there you have it. I talk like I talk. I've always talked like this. Why do black people hate me so much? Why do they associate my speaking the Queen's English with denying my blackness? When did intelligence become something to be mocked and shamed for? So now, here I was again with a black man clowning me for not tap dancing black enough. And I really have to end this video off on saying that when I read this, I can almost understand. And here's what is interesting. Here's what's intense. The fact that Billy Porter is making a biopic about James Baldwin is interesting and almost fitting, if not also entirely misguided. Because if you've seen my James Baldwin video on his conversation with Nikki Giovanni, you can see that in James Baldwin's body of work and his rhetoric, there is a lot missing in terms of his gender politic and how he represents, talks about, and respects the plight of the black woman. That is something I will never deny. I want to dig into it more. It's something important because I think it's something missing in the critiques against James Baldwin. In that video, I basically purport that Baldwin is saying that his trauma as a black man should matter more than black women's trauma because black men are the backbone of our community. And what Billy Porter is saying, we can kind of see a sort of similar longing, because in James Baldwin's lifetime, he was constantly rejected by black men, torn down by Eldridge Cleaver, had shit talked about him by the Black Panther Party. There is this long-standing homophobia that James Baldwin had to deal with that Billy Porter also had to deal with. You can see it here in his descriptions of his bullying growing up, in the homophobic context of his religious background. You can see it in the way the media and the industry and other black people treated him. Even in this, in the language that I read, Porter is essentially saying, when people criticize me for talking this way, they're criticizing me for talking intelligent. And Porter's response, I grew up with it. I talk how I talk. People can easily say, you talk white, you don't care about black people, blah, 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 blah. I've learned enough about my blackness to know that this is a fucking lie. I've also studied enough of my black history. I've also studied enough queer history, anarchist history, radical history to know that when other black people say this, it's their idea of blackness that they're projecting onto you. But what I think is interesting, starting there and where it leads you, there are these different paths. And we can see that James Baldwin went abroad, engaged in all different kinds of cultures, struggled to write, struggled to connect with like the hypermilitarism that came out of the post-civil rights era, struggled to connect with other black people. But James Baldwin always seemed to have this deep desire to be legible to other black people, even if that legibility largely was the desire to be legible to other black men.
It looks like a black man can't make it with a black woman. If somebody looks at the two of us, man, we're the weirdest looking people on earth because you went your way and I went my way, which is saying the same thing. And that's sort of a shame to say
Nikki,
that I can't have a black man standing with me and you can't have a black woman, because we wouldn't be who we are if we had. And that's a fact.
But Nikki, we are, nevertheless, we are here, we met.
Oh, you and I met. But I'm talking about for the statement, man. You're looking like a Huey Newton.
Yeah.
He can't make it with a black. Who could be his woman?
We don't know.
Oh, it's such a shame.
We don't know that much about the man.
Which I think opens him up to many kinds of misogynistic and misogynoir adjacent arguments, sentiments, ideas, thoughts, expressions. With Billy Porter, we can see that his rejection at the hands of men and various parts of the Black community has pushed him to be in this place where, in a lot of ways, I think Billy Porter thinks he's a representation of his own. And that this representation kind of means that he's worked past all these obstacles, so other people should do it in the same way as well. That is how you gain respect. That is how you gain acclaim. But what this ignores is the vast array of discrimination still facing LGBTQIA, especially trans people. It ignores the deep connection between James Baldwin, the civil rights movement, growing sentiments among Black people who started to understand and see Israel as a force of colonial violence, and how Baldwin's trauma at least compelled him to demand a greater humanism and a greater demand for a sort of international solidarity with other marginalized people, other marginalized movements, other people in other parts of the world. And granted, you can see in James Baldwin's later years, like he was trying to write more towards the times and media and gender, and he was kind of trying to expand his kind of line of logic, although gender, of course, was missing in a lot of that in ways that I think are meaningful to Black women. In this kind of conundrum, we can see that James Baldwin attempted to use his trauma and the dissonance he felt with the Black community to dig deeper, to try to fight for relevance by further representing himself as a Black artist. You can see the shift in his later years towards wanting to be seen more as a Negro writer or as a writer who's down for the culture. Porter is afraid of losing money, wants to have the stability in the industry, also believes that other people are unjustly complaining about being locked out or not being acknowledged. And also Porter is aligned with a certain kind of colonial logic, which says my individual progress is a sign of a collective path forward. And that individual progress can be steeped in ignorance. It can be steeped in Palestinian erasure. It can be steeped in needing to align yourself with capitalists, with people like Byron Allen, who are worth millions and millions of dollars. And it really is an expression of queer individualism leading to someone being aligned with a colonial logic, a supremacist logic, a logic that is okay with other people being beneath you in order for you to get to your version of success. And the reason that I think this is so interesting and complicated and necessary for me to talk about is because when I look at James Baldwin and Billy Porter, I almost see different versions of what I could end up like, or the person I could have been. Growing up and being bullied and teased and gay bashed myself as a kid, as a teenager, I did grow up in a family that had anti-Black sentiments. And as I got older, especially as I got into college and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, I learned to shed those sentiments because not only one, did I grow up in all Black schools and I started to understand like Blackness in a different way than my family ever could. I started to also understand that the sense of progress that my family tried to feed me was always antithetical to a kind of Black collectivism. In order for you to succeed and to get your own, you have to kind of look at your community and kind of see that they're doing things wrong. And that's why like Black people collectively haven't gotten to where we need to be. And this isn't to say that this is exactly what Billy Porter is purporting or anything that like James Baldwin is purporting, but I'm talking about how individualism and the desire for one's own progress, if not done with humanism and consciousness and a deep sense of history, it can lead people to blame the victim of structural violence. And this is where I think the anti-Blackness and the individualism and the kind of turning away from the more marginalized parts of our communities can be extremely insidious, because not only is Billy Porter doing this, but he's also aligning himself with the Project of Zionism. Even since October 7th, it killed close to over 30,000 Palestinians, has injured over 80,000 Palestinians. And right now, Rafah, one of the last places that Palestinians have been told that they can flee to and be safe, is also being targeted. And so in this discussion of queer trauma representation, I think we have to have a real conversation with ourselves about how trauma can feed illusions that can lead us to align with colonization, with state violence, with social domination and hierarchy, when instead trauma should be a force of consciousness raising. It should be a force that encourages us to be more in community with other, to find our collective path of healing, and to use that healing to drive us towards action. And what that action can look like are LGBTQIA people coming together to tell our own versions of our histories. It can look like LGBTQIA people doing the work, whether through academia or action or through culture, to dismantle these different versions of historical erasure, to demand a more complex retelling of our own histories. And I think the fact that James Baldwin's birthday is coming up, it's August 2nd, it's his 100th birthday, all of these questions are really, really important, because when I read Baldwin, I read so much of the trauma that he was trying to work through, and some of it he did, some of it I think he was still trying to find a place to actually write about it. And I also think he dealt with mental health struggles. He dealt with ableism. He dealt with his own community in a lot of ways turning against him. And I see a similar line of logic with Porter, and I see how that line of logic is literally steering him towards the White House and kissing Joe Biden's hand. When we are analyzing, looking at our trauma, using it as fuel to move forward, our trauma should actually lead us to action, to mobilize for ourselves and to mobilize and advocate for other people. I went through a lot of shit growing up and being queer. I went through a lot of shit being queer in my Jamaican family. I went through a lot of shit being queer in the Black community, in the white community, in every fucking community. But I will be damned if my subjugation, the ways that I've been discriminated against, the ways that I've been otherized, the ways that I've suffered emotionally, psychologically, physically, I'll be damned if that leads me towards ignoring the pain and suffering of other people. And I think the ways that queerness has taught me to be subversive, it's taught me to not respect legibility. It's taught me to not respect the binary. And it's also taught me to redefine what success means for me. Because if success was supposed to be a white picket fence and a family and kids and a job and stability, what does it mean when those same systems can discriminate against you and your people, legally or not legally? And they still tell you that you need to come here because this is where the success is. And instead, what I desire are more subversive narratives in the mainstream. I desire a more complex reading of history. And I desire that LGBTQI people hold each other to task for trying to use our traumas to subjugate other people and or erase our own histories and stories, because that I will not stand for. And I will criticize Billy Porter, and I will also criticize James Baldwin, just as I will look at my own history and myself and say, how can I do better? What are the ways that I can be more aligned with liberation? And how can I use what I know to help other people learn as well? To end, we should recognize that Porter aims to represent Black progress at the expense of a deeper analysis of what has gotten us here in the first place. And what has gotten us here is capitalism, is colonization, is racial hierarchy, and this demand for individualism. And once we turn away from all of these things, we can maybe begin to seek a better path moving forward. Thank you for watching another video on my channel. I thank everyone for watching. I am so happy to have this video come out before James Baldwin's birthday. August is going to be a lot of James Baldwin content. If you are enjoying this channel and you're enjoying the content that I'm making, I really please ask you to like this video, comment, and subscribe. And if you really want to support this channel, consider becoming a channel member or becoming a member on my Patreon, where I will always upload early access to videos as well as other exclusive Patreon live streams. Making these videos are the joy of my heart. They're helping me research a lot of other things. Yeah, let me know what you think about this discussion of queer trauma. Did it help you realize or understand things about how LGBTQI people work through our pain and suffering? Were there certain things about Porter that you didn't know in this video? And do you think Porter is doing the best that he can? Or do you think that LGBTQIA people can always be doing more, especially those with the platform?
I lived, that's my life they're talking about. And they discovered enough finally to discover that I might have a reason for being in the streets. Well, you can hardly expect me to pick up my tambourine and start dancing because they finally figured that much out. I think it comes as news to a great many of my co-citizens that the reason that black people are in the streets has to do with the lives they're forced to lead in this country.